This is Riot, a new video game expected to come out this summer. A video game that simulates street confrontations that have actually happened. You could be a protester in Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring. Or you could be a police officer called in to disperse rioters at Valsusa, Italy, where protests over a new light rail train turned ugly in 2011. Riot is part of a new breed of video game that puts the player in a new set of shoes, that of a protagonist who doesn't necessarily have much power. Like in the game This War of Mine. There, you play a non-combatant in a war zone. You aren't a soldier, you're just a citizen trying to survive. Like a 9-year-old boy after the siege of Sarajevo in 1992, whose story is based on the real-life experiences of Emir Cherimovic.
There were mortar shells and bombs falling on the streets. There were thugs creeping around houses and shops, killing and looting.
And then there's Spirits of Spring, where you play a Cree boy who's bullied. That game comes from Montreal company Minority Media. The creative director based the story on his own experiences of being bullied when he was a child. It was the head of Minority Media, Vander Caballero, who realized that a new genre of video games was emerging and it needed a label. He coined the term empathy games to describe the games his team created. But with or without the label, game designers all over the world have been creating games with empathy in mind. Now, to be sure, first-person video games have always placed you in the shoes of someone else, and some mainstream games do create empathy. The difference here is that the specific goal is to get you to empathize with the characters and inhabit their emotional lives. So what's driving this trend, and why now?
I think the average player of games is tired of the same thing. There's a desire to continue a love of games in a more serious fashion, one that's more important than just piloting Mario around his little fantasy world.
This is Ian Bogost.
Hey, how are you?
He's an author, game designer, and a professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology. He thinks eliciting empathy in a video game is different than in any other type of storytelling.
If you think about art, especially the narrative arts, film and literature and so forth, the way we think about empathy typically is really, more like creating a character or another individual that you can kind of sort of imagine where they're coming from. You can perhaps envision yourself in their shoes, and you try to empathize with their plight and their situation, but it's never really the same as your own, of course, because you're just a viewer or a reader. So one of the things about games that's different is that you're not just watching something, you're making choices, you're enacting actions inside of the experience. And something is different about that kind of empathy. It's a subtle distinction, but an important one, because instead of the empathy being a matter of sort of just kind of affective feeling that's emanating from your head and your heart toward the screen or the pages of the book, it's rather about the decisions that you can make, almost like what it feels like to be inside of the sort of logic of that other individual's life, what kinds of choices are available, which ones aren't, and what it feels like to operate the machinery of their world. So it's a subtly different kind of empathy, but also one that's related to the sort that we're used to seeing in traditional narrative media.
Mm-hmm. Do you think in that sense it sort of increases the sense of having something at stake because you're the one that's making the choice and maybe making the wrong choice?
When you make a choice, it's your choice rather than it being a character's choice. And so if you watch a lot of television or movies, or you read novels, often you may feel like, wait, what happened? Why did the character do that? Or I realize I have no understanding of where that character's coming from, and it may break the immersion, but also it just comes from nowhere. Whereas in the game, it's your choice, and you have to live with it.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's also a way in which it gets beyond this sort of more cerebral side into something that's more emotional, or maybe even sort of physical in terms of the way it manifests in your body?
Well, this is a tension, I think, in games, and it's a tension that shifts and changes over time. The delightful and beneficial feature of games, which could also be seen as their flaws, that they're very logical apparatuses. They're computer software, and you have these resources you manage, and you make choices and you build things. And if you think about a game, like Civilization or SimCity, where you're kind of at a remove and you're building stuff and things are happening below you, but you're kind of in charge, and also you're making these kind of calculated decisions. That's actually quite a bit different from being embodied inside of an individual character, or being presented with a character who you can empathize with in the way that you might be familiar with from other media. And I think right now in games there's a kind of collision between those philosophies. On the one hand, some argue, and I've certainly made this argument in the past, that former kind of empathy, where you're not just embodying an individual character, but a system, the system of the city that you live in, or the planet, or what have you. That these are actually powerful maneuvers that we actually need. We need to feel some sort of empathy, not just individuals or with ourselves, but with much larger and more complex systems, in order to make change in the world that will be long lasting. And I think we see these different moves come and go in games over many years and many decades. If you go back to the 1980s, for example, there were the same sort of tensions between what were called interactive fictions at the time, these sort of text-based games, and more systems-based games. And we saw this again in the early 2000s with what were then referred to as serious games, which are supposed to be about weighty topics. And so, there's an ebb and a flow of some of the same trends. And like any art form, we return to the same problems over and over again.
So when you talk about those two different types of empathy, that kind of systems level empathy and the one-on-one level empathy, how do you go about building that into the design process?
Well, there are different design philosophies for every style of game, and of course for every creator. For me, as a designer who's very interested in sort of systems-oriented gameplay, and the empathy of feeling what it's like to kind of be subjected to a circumstance or a scenario that's different from the one that you occupy, rather than a specific individual. You look at the world, and you find these systems. Like, how does it behave? And what is the part of it that you find interesting and appealing? And a lot of my work, I'm really fascinated with kind of mundane, repetitive, laborious work, especially work in particular, the kind of menial labor of working in restaurants or copy shops or what have you. And there's a game that offers an interesting example. It's not one of my games, but it's a similar style of game by a friend of mine named Paolo Pedercini. And he made this game about running a global fast food business. It was called the McDonald's game, but it was profoundly unendorsed by McDonald's. And he showed all these sort of questionable ethical dilemmas that you get yourself in when you're trying to manage all of the ups and downs of keeping a large business like this operational. And do you want to sort of raise the rainforest to make more room for soy fields, or do you want to enact marketing to children that is perhaps somewhat unethical? And you find yourself kind of faced with these dilemmas that you have to eventually make some bad choices if you want to keep the game running. So, this is an interesting game in that, you're meant to empathize with the system of this global business, but not really in order to feel for it, rather in order to ask questions about it, or to sort of see how it works, or at least to see Pedercini's perspective on how it works. But at the same time, I've had students, when I have them play it, who say, "Wow, I really feel for the CEOs of big companies now. They have such a hard job." Now, you might contrast that with someone like Vander Caballero's design philosophy. This is the designer behind Papo.io and this newer game called Spirits of Spring. And in a talk that he gave at one of the game developers conferences, he listed these sort of 4 approaches or 4 properties of empathy games, which I think is a term that we can attribute to him, or at least to Papo.io as a kind of origin point. And those were having a story, having a personal story connected to an individual character. And you look at those games, and they're very allegorical. They're not really about the specifics of alcoholism or what have you. They're really about sort of a fable for it, in which a sort of almost magical realist environment is portraying a more serious topic. And the third of these was closure, which is really interesting, very narrative oriented. And his idea here is that most people don't finish games. And so you need to give these kinds of games an ending that wraps it up and ties it in a bow, which is very much the opposite of the systems-oriented design that just kind of goes on forever.
Right. I mean, in terms of the effectiveness of these kinds of empathy games, I was just thinking, Riot takes place in real places using real events that have actually happened, like the Tahrir Revolution in Egypt. So what impact does actually the realness of the simulation have on the amount of empathy that a player might feel?
I think that the average player and the average game maker seem to resist real world reference. And it's always been a curiosity to me. And this, I speak as someone who's also been very interested in the journalistic applications of games and who's made games that, I sort of call documentarian in their nature and in their goals. I don't have an answer to why that is, but one theory is that the video game playership is almost like a science fiction readership, right? The use of these sort of semi-fictionalized scenario to present a version of real world events, but such that you can look at them in a slightly different way, and you don't have to feel like they're quite as didactic, beating you over the head with an issue that you've heard on the news. That those seem to create more receptivity. Whether or not they create more empathy or more enlightenment or more knowledge is certainly an open question. But I find it intriguing that games in general have so resisted explicit commentary about the world, which is, of course, not the case in literature and film at all.
Do you think there might be a downside to this in some types of applications, though, in the sense that, if it is more sort of emotionally or gut-driven rather than having a kind of a rational, balanced analysis of an issue?
Right. And, I've been arguing that the sort of, rational side of games, the ability to present a version of how something works and to present it in this sort of deliberate non-fictional way is one of the terrific powers that games offer that other media don't. But I also understand that there's this sort of suspicion of that ideal and a need among a new generation of players and of creators to find their own voice, create their own forms. One of the things about this frame of empathy games that we ought to acknowledge is that it has a rhetorical function as well. It's a piece of the market and says, here's where the empathy lies, which is actually kind of a weird idea, isn't it? You don't turn on the television and sort of go to the empathy channel so that you can watch the empathy shows. It's just assumed that empathy is baked in to these media, and good works would provide empathy and bad ones would fail to. So we're trying so hard, I think, to respond to this concern or this trivialization of games that perhaps we're overcorrecting in a way.
What do you think is driving this trend in empathy games? I mean, I know you say it's been around for a while, but it does seem to be having an uptick now. What's going on there? Well,
I think that the fact that we have a market for the first time is really maybe the most important thing. There's something about the validation of a game, like the sorts that we've been talking about, that it's not just this sort of weird half game or not game. It's not this strange piece of amateur media, but it's put on the same level as these other games. You can go onto Steam and you can buy any commercial game you want, or you can buy one of these alternative games. You can log on to the App Store on your phone, and you can find Spirits of Spring alongside Bejeweled or Candy Crush or whatever the latest action game is. And that opportunity to kind of put things on the shelf next to much more materially successful and mass market appeal kinds of games is important. It's something that we've never had in games. And by putting work together in the same context, it validates all of those forms against one another, and it says this other kind, this thing that you haven't seen before, this is real. And I wouldn't underestimate how important that is with these sorts of games. So even though it seems like a somewhat instrumental observation, or maybe even a commercial one, to say, well, the marketplace is the most important feature here, the ability to just distribute and sell these games, I think it has a lot to do with the current success, along with this receptivity I've been trying to describe.
Ian, thanks so much for sharing your insight.
Thanks so much for having me.
Ian Bogost is a video game designer, professor, and the author of several books all about video games. We've got a link to him up at our website, as well as the trailers for some of the empathy video games we mentioned, cbc.ca/spark.